Margaret Whitmore had everything money could buy, but she couldn't purchase the one thing her heart desperately needed: her daughter's voice. 8-year-old Emma sat in the corner of the grand living room, surrounded by the finest toys and books that wealth could provide, yet she remained as silent as the marble statues that decorated their mansion's entrance hall. The Whitmore estate stood like a fortress on the hill, its towering walls and iron gates separating the family from the outside world. Inside, servants moved quietly through polished corridors, their footsteps muffled by Persian rugs worth more than most people's homes. Margaret often wondered if the silence that filled their home had somehow seeped into her daughter's soul. Emma had stopped speaking 3 years ago, right after the accident that took her father's life. David Whitmore had been driving home from a business meeting when a drunk driver ran a red light. The collision was instant and fatal. Emma, who had been Daddy's little girl, witnessed the aftermath when the police came to their door. The trauma specialist said children sometimes retreat into silence when faced with overwhelming grief, but Margaret had tried everything to bring her daughter back. The best child psychologists in the country had examined Emma. Speech therapists with impressive credentials had worked with her for months. Margaret had even hired a team of specialists who claimed they could cure selective mutism through innovative techniques. Nothing worked. Emma would nod, shake her head, or point when absolutely necessary, but she never spoke a single word. Dr. Harrison, Emma's current therapist, had gently suggested that forcing the issue might make things worse. He recommended patience, love, and creating a safe environment where Emma might eventually feel comfortable speaking again, but Margaret was running out of patience. She watched other mothers chatting with their daughters at school events, sharing secrets and laughter, while Emma clung to her side in complete silence. The mansion felt like a museum most days. Margaret had kept everything exactly as it was when David was alive, hoping that familiar surroundings might comfort Emma. But now she wondered if the memories trapped in these walls were part of the problem. Every room held echoes of happier times when Emma's laughter had filled the space, when father and daughter would play hide and seek among the grand furniture, when bedtime stories were requested with eager whispers. Margaret's own grief had hardened into a protective shell around her heart. She threw herself into managing David's business empire, attending board meetings and making decisions that affected thousands of employees. Work became her escape from the painful silence at home. She hired the best nannies money could buy to care for Emma, but none of them seemed to connect with her withdrawn daughter. The household staff had learned to communicate with Emma through gestures and gentle smiles. Mrs. Henderson, the head housekeeper, would pat Emma's shoulder when she brought her afternoon snack. James, the butler, would wink at her when he served dinner. But these small interactions felt hollow to Margaret, who longed to hear her daughter's thoughts and feelings. School was another challenge entirely. Emma attended the most prestigious, private academy in the city, where the teachers were trained to work with children who had special needs, but even there she remained isolated. While other children played and chattered during recess, Emma would sit alone under a tree, drawing pictures in a sketchbook she carried everywhere. The drawings worried Margaret. Emma's artwork had changed dramatically since the accident. Where she once drew bright flowers and smiling families, now she created dark, shadowy figures in empty rooms. The school counselor had shown Margaret several of these drawings, pointing out the recurring themes of isolation and sadness that appeared in her daughter's work. Margaret had tried to connect with Emma through activities they used to enjoy together. She set up art sessions in the sunroom, hoping that creating something beautiful might unlock her daughter's voice. She attempted to read the fairy tales that Emma had once loved, but the little girl would simply stare out the window, lost in her own world. The loneliness was crushing. Margaret found herself talking to Emma constantly, filling the silence with chatter about their day, the weather, or plans for the weekend. But having a one-sided conversation with your own child was heartbreaking. She would pause hopefully after asking questions, waiting for any response, but Emma's lips remained sealed. Friends and extended family had their own opinions about the situation. Some suggested that Margaret was being too soft, that Emma needed firm boundaries to snap out of her selective silence. Others recommended residential treatment centers or specialized boarding schools. Margaret had considered all these options, but something deep inside told her that sending Emma away would only make things worse. The family doctor had prescribed mild anxiety medication to help Emma sleep better, but Margaret was reluctant to rely on drugs to solve their problems. She wanted her daughter to heal naturally, to find her way back to the world of the living through love and understanding rather than chemical intervention. At night, Margaret would sit by Emma's bed, watching her daughter sleep peacefully. In those quiet moments, she would whisper prayers and promises, begging whatever force controlled the universe to give her back her chatty, curious little girl. She missed Emma's questions about everything from why the sky was blue to whether angels really had wings. The silence was affecting Margaret's own ability to function. She found herself snapping at employees and board members, her patience worn thin by the constant worry about Emma. Her sister called regularly, offering to take Emma for weekends or longer visits, but Margaret was terrified of letting her daughter out of her sight. What if something else terrible happened? Margaret had begun to accept that this might be their new reality. Perhaps Emma would never speak again. Perhaps they would navigate the rest of their lives through gestures and written notes. The thought was devastating, but she was learning to love her daughter exactly as she was, silence and all. Little did Margaret know that change was coming to their household in the form of someone completely unexpected. Someone who would see Emma not as a broken child who needed fixing, but as a little girl who simply needed to be understood. Someone whose own life experiences had taught her that sometimes the most powerful communication happens without words, and that healing comes from the most unlikely places. The advertisement Margaret had placed for a new housekeeper would soon bring someone into their lives who would challenge everything they thought they knew about communication, family, and the power of human connection. This woman would arrive, with her own stories of hardship and resilience, carrying wisdom that no expensive therapy could provide. Ruby Washington stepped off the city bus at the corner of Maple and Fifth, clutching a worn leather purse that contained everything she owned of value. The classified ad in the newspaper had been brief: experienced housekeeper needed for private residence. References required: good pay for the right person. She had circled it 3 times before finding the courage to call. At 52, Ruby had worked in more wealthy homes than she could count. She had cleaned up after spoiled children and demanding adults, always keeping her head down and her opinions to herself. But life had taught her that every family had its secrets, and the richest families often had the deepest wounds hidden behind their perfect facades. The Whitmore mansion loomed before her like something from a movie. Ruby had grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment with 4 siblings, where privacy was a luxury and silence was impossible. This house, with its manicured lawns and towering windows, represented a world she had only glimpsed from the outside. Yet here she was, walking up the circular driveway to what might become her new workplace. Mrs. Henderson, the head housekeeper who had conducted Ruby's phone interview, met her at the servants' entrance. The older woman was kind but businesslike, explaining that the household ran on strict schedules and that Mrs. Whitmore valued discretion above all else. Ruby nodded, understanding the code. Don't ask questions, don't gossip, and don't get too attached to the family's problems. The tour of the mansion was overwhelming. Ruby counted 12 bedrooms, 8 bathrooms, a library that looked like something from a university, and a kitchen that could serve a restaurant. Everything sparkled with cleanliness and expensive polish. But despite all the luxury, something felt wrong. The house was too quiet, too perfect, like a beautiful cage that trapped everyone inside. Ruby's own story was written in the lines around her eyes and the strength in her weathered hands. She had raised 3 children as a single mother after her husband died in Vietnam. She had worked 2 jobs for 20 years, cleaning houses during the day and working at a diner at night just to keep her family together. Her children were grown now, scattered across the country with families of their own, and Ruby found herself alone for the first time in decades. The job interview with Mrs. Whitmore took place in a formal sitting room that looked like it belonged in a museum. Margaret Whitmore was younger than Ruby had expected, probably in her early 30s, but she carried herself with the rigid posture of someone much older. Her designer clothes and perfect makeup couldn't hide the sadness in her eyes. Margaret asked the standard questions about experience and references, but Ruby sensed there was something more she wanted to say. The conversation felt formal and distant until Margaret mentioned her daughter. Her voice changed when she spoke about Emma. becoming softer and more vulnerable. She explained that Emma was a quiet child who needed special understanding, but she didn't go into details. Ruby's first day of work started at 6 in the morning. She began in the kitchen, preparing breakfast according to the detailed instructions Mrs. Henderson had left for her. Everything had to be perfect. The orange juice freshly squeezed, the toast cut diagonally, the eggs cooked exactly 3 minutes. Ruby had worked in demanding households before, but this level of precision seemed excessive. It was while she was arranging flowers in the main hallway that Ruby first saw Emma. The little girl appeared at the top of the grand staircase like a ghost, her small figure dwarfed by the massive space around her. She was dressed in a beautiful blue dress with matching ribbons in her dark hair, but her face held an expression of such profound sadness that Ruby's heart immediately went out to her. Emma descended the stairs slowly, one hand trailing along the polished banister. She didn't make a sound, didn't call for her mother or ask any questions. She simply moved through the house like a shadow, observing everything but participating in nothing. Ruby watched her disappear into the breakfast room, where she knew Mrs. Whitmore was already seated with the morning newspaper. During her break, Ruby asked Mrs. Henderson about the little girl. The head housekeeper's expression grew cautious, and she explained that Emma was a special case. She had stopped speaking after her father's death and required gentle handling. The family had tried everything, Mrs. Henderson said, but nothing seemed to help. Ruby listened carefully, filing away this information for future reference. As Ruby worked throughout the house that first day, she began to notice things others might miss. Emma's drawings were displayed on the refrigerator in the kitchen, dark and troubling images that spoke of a child's inner pain. There were photographs of a happier time scattered throughout the house, images of Emma laughing with her father, building sandcastles on a beach, riding piggyback through these same hallways. The contrast was heartbreaking. Ruby could see the joyful child Emma had once been, and it made her current silence even more tragic. This wasn't just a shy child, or one who preferred books to conversation. This was a little girl who had retreated so far inside herself that she had forgotten how to reach out to the world. During lunch preparation, Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway. She stood there quietly, watching Ruby chop vegetables for the soup. Ruby smiled at her and continued working, not trying to force conversation or interaction. She had learned from raising her own children that sometimes the best way to connect with a hurt child was to simply be present without demanding anything in return. Ruby began humming while she worked, an old spiritual her grandmother had taught her years ago. The melody filled the quiet kitchen, and she noticed Emma step slightly closer. The little girl's eyes were fixed on Ruby's hands as they moved rhythmically through their tasks. But she still didn't speak or move any closer. That evening, as Ruby was finishing her duties for the day, she overheard part of a phone conversation between Mrs. Whitmore and someone who was clearly a doctor or therapist. Margaret's voice was tight with frustration as she described another failed attempt to get Emma to participate in therapy sessions. The child would sit quietly through appointments but never responded to questions or activities. Ruby had her own theories about healing and connection, wisdom passed down through generations of women who had faced unimaginable hardships and found ways to survive. She believed that some wounds were too deep for traditional medicine, that they required a different kind of treatment, one that came from the heart rather than a textbook. As she prepared to leave that first day, Ruby made a decision. She would not just be another employee who cleaned and cooked and disappeared into the background. She would find a way to reach this wounded little girl, not because it was her job, but because something in Emma's silent face reminded her of her own children during their darkest moments. The bus ride home gave Ruby time to think. She had worked for many wealthy families, but she had never encountered a situation quite like this one. Usually, children in rich households were spoiled and demanding, not silent and withdrawn. Emma's silence was different. It was protective, a shield she had built around herself to survive overwhelming pain. Ruby understood that kind of silence. She had been quiet herself as a child, not from trauma but from necessity. In her family's crowded apartment, the loudest voices got the most attention, so Ruby had learned to observe and listen instead of demanding to be heard. Maybe that experience would help her understand Emma in ways that expensive therapists couldn't. 3 weeks into her employment, Ruby had established a comfortable routine at the Whitmore mansion. She arrived each morning before sunrise, prepared breakfast with military precision, and moved through her cleaning duties with quiet efficiency. But her real focus was always on Emma, the silent child who seemed to drift through the enormous house like a lost spirit. Ruby had begun to notice patterns in Emma's behavior. The little girl always appeared in the kitchen around 10 o'clock in the morning, standing in the doorway as if asking permission to enter. She would watch Ruby work for exactly 15 minutes, then disappear back into the maze of hallways and rooms. Emma never got in the way or made demands, but her presence had become the highlight of Ruby's day. During Emma's visits, Ruby had started a subtle campaign of connection. She would hum different songs each day. Watching to see which melodies caught the child's attention, she noticed that Emma's eyes brightened when she heard gospel songs, the kind that told stories of overcoming hardship and finding hope in dark times. Ruby had grown up singing these songs in her grandmother's church, where music was medicine for troubled souls. Margaret Whitmore remained distant and formal with all the household staff, including Ruby. She spent most of her time in the home office, conducting business calls and reviewing financial documents. Ruby could hear the tension in her voice during these conversations, the way her words became clipped and sharp when discussing company matters. Work had clearly become Margaret's escape from the painful reality of her daughter's condition. The other servants spoke in whispers about the family's tragedy. Mrs. Henderson had worked for the Whitmores for over 10 years and remembered when the house was full of laughter. She told Ruby about birthday parties where Emma would sing at the top of her lungs, about Christmas mornings when the little girl would wake up before dawn and run through the halls, calling for her parents to come see what Santa had brought. Ruby learned that David Whitmore had been more than just a successful businessman. He had been the emotional heart of the family, the one who brought joy and spontaneity to their structured lives. He would come home from work and immediately sweep Emma into elaborate games of pretend, turning the formal living room into a pirate ship or a castle, where she was the brave princess saving the day. The accident had stolen more than Emma's father. It had taken her voice, her joy, and her connection to the world around her. Ruby understood this kind of loss intimately. When her own husband had died, her 3 children had each responded differently to their grief. Her youngest son had become angry and destructive, while her daughter had cried for months, but her middle child, Marcus, had simply stopped talking for nearly 6 months. Ruby remembered the panic she had felt during Marcus's silent period. She had taken him to doctors and counselors just like Margaret was doing with Emma. But in the end, it wasn't professional help that brought Marcus back to the world of words. It was patience, love, and creating safe spaces where he could begin to heal at his own pace. One morning, while Ruby was polishing the silver in the dining room, she heard the sound of piano music drifting down from upstairs. The melody was haunting and beautiful, played with surprising skill. Ruby followed the sound to a music room on the 2nd floor, where she found Emma seated at a magnificent grand piano, her small fingers moving across the keys with practiced precision. Ruby stood in the doorway, careful not to interrupt this private moment. Emma's eyes were closed as she played, and for the first time since Ruby had met her, the child's face looked peaceful. The music seemed to pour out of her like water from a broken dam, expressing all the emotions she couldn't put into words. The piece Emma was playing was complex and melancholy, far beyond what Ruby would have expected from an 8-year-old. But as she listened, Ruby realized that this was Emma's true voice, not the words she had lost, but the music that still lived inside her heart. This was how she communicated with the world when no one was listening, how she processed her grief and pain. When the song ended, Emma opened her eyes and saw Ruby standing there. Instead of running away or looking embarrassed, she simply turned back to the piano and began another piece. This one was lighter, almost hopeful, and Ruby took it as an invitation to step closer. Ruby approached the piano carefully, not wanting to break the spell that music had cast over the room. She stood beside the bench and listened as Emma played, recognizing some classical pieces her own children had learned during their brief piano lessons years ago. But Emma played with an emotional depth that went far beyond technical skill. When Emma finished the 2nd piece, she looked up at Ruby with questioning eyes. Ruby smiled and hummed a few bars of Amazing Grace, wondering if Emma might know the melody. To her surprise, Emma's fingers found the keys and began playing a simple version of the hymn, following Ruby's hummed melody with remarkable accuracy. For the next 20 minutes, Ruby hummed familiar songs while Emma translated them into piano music. They worked together in perfect harmony, creating a conversation that needed no words. Ruby felt tears gathering in her eyes as she realized this was the first real connection she had made with the silent child. This discovery changed everything for Ruby. She began incorporating music into her daily routine, humming while she worked and paying attention to which songs drew Emma closer. She noticed that Emma was particularly drawn to songs with strong emotional content, hymns about finding strength in difficult times, folk songs about family and home, lullabies that spoke of protection and love. Ruby also started leaving little musical gifts for Emma to find. She would hum a new melody while cleaning Emma's bedroom, then pretend to forget about it, hoping Emma might pick up the tune and make it her own. Sometimes she would find sheets of handwritten music on Emma's desk, simple compositions that seemed to capture the child's complex emotions. Margaret began to notice the change in atmosphere around the house. The silence felt less oppressive somehow, filled with Ruby's gentle humming and the occasional sound of piano music floating down from upstairs. She commented to Mrs. Henderson that Emma seemed slightly less withdrawn, though she couldn't put her finger on exactly what was different. Ruby was careful not to push too hard or move too fast. She understood that trust had to be built slowly, one note at a time. Emma had been hurt by well-meaning adults who wanted quick results, who saw her silence as a problem to be solved rather than a natural response to overwhelming trauma. The breakthrough came on a rainy Tuesday morning in October. Ruby was preparing lunch when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway as usual, but this time she was carrying her sketchbook and a pencil. Instead of just watching, Emma sat down at the kitchen table and began to draw while Ruby worked. Ruby glanced over at Emma's drawing and saw something that made her heart skip a beat. Instead of the dark, lonely figures Emma usually created, she was sketching a woman at a stove, surrounded by musical notes that seemed to dance around her like butterflies. At the bottom of the page, in careful child's handwriting, Emma had written 2 words. Thank you. It wasn't speech, but it was communication. It was Emma reaching across the silence to acknowledge that someone finally understood her language. Ruby felt overwhelmed with emotion as she realized that they were no longer strangers sharing the same space. They were becoming friends who spoke the same wordless language of music and understanding. The thank you note marked the beginning of a new chapter in Ruby and Emma's relationship. Over the following weeks, Emma began leaving small drawings and written messages for Ruby to find throughout the house. They were simple communications. A picture of a sunrise with "Good morning" written underneath. A sketch of Ruby's hands kneading bread with "I like watching you work" in careful cursive. Ruby treasured each note like a precious gift. She understood that Emma was testing the waters, seeing if this new form of communication would be accepted and valued. Ruby made sure to respond to every message, sometimes with her own simple drawings or by humming songs that matched the mood of Emma's artwork. The piano sessions became a daily ritual. Each afternoon, after lunch was served and the dishes were cleaned, Emma would appear in the music room. Ruby would join her there, and they would spend an hour creating their wordless conversations through melody and rhythm. Ruby discovered that Emma could play almost any song by ear after hearing it just once or twice. During these musical interludes, Ruby began sharing stories from her own life through the songs she chose. She hummed lullabies her grandmother had sung to her, work songs from the factories where she had labored as a young woman, and spirituals that had carried her family through difficult times. Each song was a window into Ruby's world, and Emma seemed to absorb these stories with hungry attention. Margaret started joining them occasionally, drawn by the sound of her daughter's piano playing. She would stand in the doorway, watching in amazement as Emma's face came alive with emotion while she played. These were the first moments of genuine joy Margaret had seen from her daughter since the accident, and she felt both grateful and slightly jealous of Ruby's ability to reach Emma when all her expensive experts had failed. Ruby noticed Margaret's complex emotions and understood them completely. As a mother herself, Ruby knew how painful it must be to watch a stranger connect with your child in ways you couldn't. But Ruby also recognized that Margaret's own grief was creating a barrier between mother and daughter. Margaret was so afraid of losing Emma completely that she had become frozen, unable to risk the vulnerability that true connection required. One evening, as Ruby was preparing to leave for the day, Margaret approached her in the kitchen. The conversation started formally, with Margaret thanking Ruby for her excellent work and her positive influence on Emma. But as they talked, Margaret's composure began to crack, and she found herself sharing her fears and frustrations with this woman who seemed to understand her daughter in ways she didn't. Margaret confessed that she felt like a failure as a mother. She had tried everything the experts recommended: structured therapy sessions, special schools, medication consultations. She had rearranged her entire life around Emma's needs, but nothing seemed to help. Watching Ruby succeed where she had failed felt like both a blessing and a painful reminder of her own inadequacies. Ruby listened without judgment. Recognizing the familiar sound of a mother's guilt and desperation, she shared her own experiences with Marcus during his silent period, describing the helplessness she had felt and the mistakes she had made along the way. She explained that healing wasn't about finding the right technique or professional. It was about creating space for a hurt child to feel safe enough to begin opening up again. The conversation between Ruby and Margaret lasted over an hour, and it marked a turning point in their relationship. Margaret began to see Ruby not just as an employee, but as someone who truly understood the challenges of raising a traumatized child. Ruby, in turn, gained insight into the depth of Margaret's love for Emma and her desperate desire to help her daughter heal. This new understanding led to changes in the household routine. Margaret began joining the piano sessions more regularly, not as an observer but as a participant. Ruby taught her some simple melodies, and Margaret discovered that she could contribute to their musical conversations even without advanced skills. Emma seemed delighted to have her mother join their special time, and she began creating little compositions that clearly included parts for both Ruby and Margaret to hum or clap along with. Ruby also suggested small changes to help Emma feel more connected to the family's daily life. Instead of having Emma eat meals in silence while Margaret conducted business calls, Ruby recommended setting aside phone-free time for family meals. She showed Margaret how to communicate with Emma through gestures and shared activities, building connection without the pressure of forced conversation. The transformation wasn't dramatic or sudden, but it was steady and meaningful. Emma began spending more time in common areas of the house instead of hiding in her room. She started helping Ruby with simple cooking tasks, standing on a step stool to wash vegetables or stir soup while Ruby worked nearby. These shared activities created natural opportunities for connection, without the artificial pressure of therapy sessions. Ruby introduced Emma to some of the children's songs she had sung with her own kids years ago. Emma was particularly drawn to songs that told stories, ballads about brave children overcoming challenges, folk tales set to music, and spirituals that spoke of finding light in darkness. Ruby realized that Emma was using these songs to process her own experiences and emotions. One afternoon, while they were working together in the kitchen, Emma began humming along with Ruby's singing for the first time. Her voice was soft and uncertain at first, barely audible above the sound of chopping vegetables. But as Ruby continued singing, Emma's voice grew stronger and more confident. By the end of the song, she was humming the harmony line with clear, sweet tones. Ruby felt tears gathering in her eyes, but she forced herself to continue working normally, not wanting to make Emma self-conscious about this breakthrough. After they finished preparing dinner, Ruby casually mentioned to Margaret that Emma had been humming beautifully while they worked. Margaret's face lit up with joy and hope, though Ruby warned her not to pressure Emma about it. The humming became a regular part of Emma's participation in household activities. She would hum while helping Ruby fold laundry, while drawing in her sketchbook, and during their piano sessions. Her voice was lovely, clear and true, with a natural sense of pitch and rhythm that suggested real musical talent. Ruby began to wonder if music might be Emma's path back to full communication. She had seen this before with her own children. Sometimes a child who couldn't express emotions in words could pour everything into song or art. Maybe Emma didn't need to be fixed or cured. Maybe she just needed to be understood and accepted exactly as she was, while being given safe opportunities to expand her ways of connecting with the world. The household staff noticed the changes too. Mrs. Henderson commented that Emma seemed more present during family activities. James, the butler, mentioned that Emma had started making eye contact when he served her meals. Even the gardener, who rarely interacted with the family directly, noticed that Emma had begun watching him work from her bedroom window, sometimes waving when he looked up at her. These small improvements gave everyone in the household hope that Emma was slowly finding her way back to the world of human connection. But Ruby understood that the real test would come when Emma felt ready to risk using words again. That breakthrough would require perfect timing, absolute safety, and probably a crisis that demanded more communication than gestures and humming could provide. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing the Whitmore estate in pristine snow that transformed the mansion into something from a fairy tale. Emma spent hours at her bedroom window, watching the flakes fall and creating elaborate drawings of the winter wonderland outside. Her artwork had continued to evolve, becoming brighter and more detailed as her emotional healing progressed. Ruby had been working for the family for nearly 4 months now, and the changes in Emma were undeniable. The little girl had begun participating more actively in household activities, helping Ruby with cooking and cleaning in ways that felt natural rather than therapeutic. She had also started leaving longer written messages for Ruby, sometimes entire pages describing her dreams or thoughts about the books she was reading. Margaret had noticed these improvements too, and she was slowly learning to communicate with Emma in new ways. Mother and daughter had developed their own system of gestures and shared activities that didn't require speech, but still fostered connection. Margaret had even started taking piano lessons herself, hoping to better participate in Emma's musical world. The breakthrough Ruby had been anticipating came on a snowy Tuesday morning in December. Ruby arrived at work to find Mrs. Henderson in a state of panic. Margaret had fallen down the front steps while leaving for an important business meeting, twisting her ankle badly and hitting her head on the ice. She was conscious but disoriented, and Mrs. Henderson was trying to decide whether to call an ambulance. Emma had witnessed the accident from her bedroom window and had run downstairs in her pajamas and bare feet. She was kneeling beside her mother in the snow, her small hands hovering over Margaret's face as if she wanted to help but didn't know how. Tears were streaming down Emma's cheeks and her whole body was shaking with fear and cold. Ruby immediately took charge of the situation. She sent James to get blankets and told Mrs. Henderson to call both an ambulance and Margaret's doctor. But her primary focus was Emma, who looked absolutely terrified. Ruby could see that the accident had triggered memories of losing her father, and the little girl was clearly reliving that traumatic experience. Ruby knelt down beside Emma and Margaret in the snow, wrapping her coat around the shivering child. Margaret was conscious but confused, asking repeatedly what had happened and where Emma was, even though her daughter was right beside her. Ruby realized that Margaret might have a concussion, and that Emma was witnessing her mother's disorientation with growing panic. The ambulance arrived within 15 minutes, but those minutes felt like hours to Ruby as she watched Emma's distress escalate. The paramedics quickly assessed Margaret's condition and determined that she needed to go to the hospital for x-rays and observation. As they prepared to load her onto a stretcher, Margaret became agitated, calling for Emma and refusing to leave without knowing her daughter was safe. Emma was clinging to Ruby's hand with desperate strength, her eyes wide with the same terror Ruby had seen on her first day of work. But this time, instead of retreating into silence, Emma was making small sounds of distress, whimpers and gasps that showed she was fighting against her own protective muteness. Ruby made a quick decision that would change everything. Instead of staying behind to comfort Emma while Margaret went to the hospital alone, she announced that they would all go together. She bundled Emma into warm clothes and followed the ambulance to the hospital, holding the little girl close as they waited in the emergency room. The hospital was a frightening place for a child who associated medical emergencies with permanent loss. The bright lights, sharp smells, and constant activity reminded Emma of the night her father had died, when police officers and paramedics had filled their house with official voices and sad faces. Ruby could feel Emma's tension increasing with every passing minute. While Margaret was being examined by doctors, Ruby and Emma sat in the waiting room surrounded by other worried families. Ruby tried to keep Emma calm by humming quietly and letting her draw in the sketchbook they had grabbed from the house. But Emma's drawings were becoming increasingly frantic, dark scribbles that showed her emotional state was deteriorating rapidly. After an hour of waiting, A nurse came out to tell them that Margaret was going to be fine. She had a sprained ankle and a mild concussion, but there was no serious damage. She would need to stay overnight for observation, but she would be coming home the next day. Ruby felt relief flood through her, but Emma seemed unable to process this good news. Ruby realized that Emma needed to see her mother with her own eyes before she could believe that history wasn't repeating itself. She convinced the hospital staff to let Emma visit Margaret's room, even though children weren't usually allowed in the emergency department. The charge nurse, a kind woman named Patricia who had children of her own, bent the rules when Ruby explained Emma's situation. Margaret was awake and coherent when they entered her room, though she looked pale and tired. Her ankle was wrapped and elevated, and there was a small bandage on her forehead where she had hit the ice, but she was clearly alive and alert, and she smiled when she saw Emma approaching hesitantly. Emma stood at the foot of the hospital bed, staring at her mother as if she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. Margaret extended her hand toward her daughter, and Emma slowly moved closer, finally allowing herself to be pulled into a careful hug that avoided Margaret's injured head and ankle. It was in that hospital room, surrounded by the beeping of monitors and the smell of antiseptic, that Emma finally found her voice again. As she clung to her mother, Ruby heard her whisper a single word so quietly it was almost inaudible. "Mama." Margaret froze, wondering if she had imagined the sound. Ruby moved closer to the bed, her heart pounding with anticipation. Emma pulled back slightly from the hug and looked directly into her mother's eyes. "Mama," Emma said again, this time clearly and deliberately. "I was scared you were going to die too." The words tumbled out of Emma after that, 3 years of silence breaking like a dam that could no longer hold back the flood. She told Margaret about her fears, her dreams, her love for the piano, and her gratitude for Ruby's patient friendship. She spoke about missing her father but being afraid to talk about him because it made Margaret sad. Margaret cried as she listened to her daughter's voice, so much deeper and more mature than it had been 3 years ago. Emma had grown up during her silent period, processing complex emotions and experiences that she was now finally ready to share. Ruby stood quietly in the corner of the hospital room, tears streaming down her own face as she witnessed this miraculous reunion between mother and daughter. She understood that her role in this moment was simply to be present, to provide the steady, supportive presence that had helped make this breakthrough possible. Emma spoke for nearly an hour, her words flowing like a river that had finally found its way around a massive boulder. She told Margaret about the music she heard in her head, about the stories she created when she drew her pictures, about watching Ruby work and learning to feel safe in the kitchen where someone understood her without demanding explanations. She also spoke about her father, sharing memories that Margaret thought had been lost forever. Emma remembered building snow forts with him in their backyard, remembered how he would make up silly songs while driving her to school, remembered the way he smelled like coffee and aftershave when he hugged her goodnight. These weren't painful memories anymore. They were treasures Emma was finally ready to share. Most importantly, Emma explained her silence in ways that no therapist had been able to help her articulate before. She told Margaret that talking had felt dangerous after Daddy died, as if words might make other terrible things happen. She had been protecting everyone by staying quiet, believing somehow that her silence could prevent more losses. Margaret listened to every word with amazement and growing understanding. She realized that Emma's silence hadn't been a rejection of communication. It had been a desperate attempt to maintain control in a world that had become unpredictable and frightening. Emma had been trying to protect her remaining family the only way her 8-year-old mind could imagine. Ruby's role in Emma's healing became clear as the little girl explained how music had become her bridge back to human connection. Ruby hadn't tried to force Emma to speak or pushed her to heal according to anyone else's timeline. Instead, she had met Emma exactly where she was and created safe spaces for gradual healing to occur naturally. As Emma continued talking, Ruby could see the relief and joy spreading across Margaret's face. This was the conversation Margaret had dreamed of having for 3 years, the proof that her daughter was still there underneath the protective silence. But more than that, it was evidence that Emma had been growing and learning and healing even during her quiet years. The hospital staff was amazed by the transformation they witnessed that evening. Nurses who had seen Emma arrive as a silent, Terrified child watched her leave as a chattering little girl who couldn't seem to stop making up for lost time. Dr. Patterson, Margaret's attending physician, commented that he had never seen such a dramatic change in a patient's family dynamics during a single hospital visit. When they finally returned home late that night, Emma insisted on helping Ruby prepare a simple dinner for Margaret, chattering constantly about everything she wanted to show her mother now that she could use words again. She had 3 years' worth of thoughts, feelings, and observations to share, and she seemed determined to catch up on every missed conversation. Ruby watched this reunion with deep satisfaction, knowing that her patient work had helped create the conditions for Emma's healing. She had understood instinctively that some children need time and safety more than they need intervention, that healing happens in its own rhythm when the right environment is provided. But Ruby also knew that her job was far from over. Emma's return to speech was just the beginning of a longer journey toward complete emotional healing. The little girl would need continued support as she learned to trust her voice again and rebuilt her confidence in communicating with the wider world beyond her family's protective walls. Emma's return to speech transformed the entire atmosphere of the Whitmore mansion. The house that had been wrapped in careful silence for 3 years suddenly rang with the sound of a child's laughter, questions, and endless chatter. Emma seemed determined to make up for every word she hadn't spoken, filling quiet moments with observations, stories, and the kind of rambling conversation that had been missing from their lives for so long. Margaret recovered quickly from her accident, but the experience had changed her relationship with both Emma and Ruby in profound ways. She realized that she had been so focused on fixing Emma's silence that she had forgotten to simply enjoy her daughter's company. Now, with Emma talking constantly, Margaret found herself treasuring even the most mundane conversations about schoolwork, favorite colors, and what they should have for lunch. Ruby watched this transformation with quiet satisfaction, but she also recognized that new challenges were emerging. Emma was experiencing what her therapist called rebound communication, an intense need to use her voice after years of silence. Sometimes this resulted in overwhelming chatter that exhausted both Emma and her listeners. Ruby helped Margaret understand that this phase was normal and temporary, part of Emma's process of relearning how to balance silence and speech. The relationship between Ruby and Emma evolved as well. With words available to them now, their friendship deepened beyond the musical communication they had developed. Emma was eager to learn about Ruby's life, asking detailed questions about her children, her childhood, and her experiences working in different homes. Ruby found herself sharing stories she hadn't told anyone in years. Drawn out by Emma's genuine curiosity and acceptance, Emma's questions revealed how much she had been observing and thinking during her silent years. She wanted to know why Ruby had chosen to work for their family, whether she missed her own children, and how she had learned to understand people without needing them to speak. These conversations showed Emma's remarkable emotional intelligence and her deep capacity for empathy. Margaret began to understand how much she had missed during Emma's silent period. Her daughter had been developing complex thoughts and feelings all along, processing her experiences in ways that didn't require words. Emma's drawings from those years, which Margaret had seen as concerning symptoms, were actually sophisticated emotional expressions that showed remarkable artistic and psychological development. The household staff was delighted by Emma's transformation. Mrs. Henderson, who had worked for the family since before Emma was born, wept the first time Emma ran up to her and said good morning in her clear, sweet voice. James found himself engaged in lengthy conversations about Emma's latest piano compositions, and even the gardener discovered that Emma had been watching his work for years and had developed strong opinions about which flowers should be planted. Where Emma's return to school was another significant milestone. Her teachers were amazed by the articulate, thoughtful child who had replaced the silent student they had known. Emma's academic abilities had never been in question, but now she could participate in class discussions, ask for help when needed, and form friendships with her classmates. However, the transition wasn't entirely smooth. Emma sometimes became overwhelmed by social situations where multiple people were talking at once. After years of careful, controlled communication, the chaos of playground conversations and classroom discussions could be overstimulating. Ruby and Margaret worked with the school to create strategies for managing these moments. Emma also struggled with the attention her transformation attracted. Word spread quickly through their small community about the miracle of the rich man's daughter finding her voice. Well-meaning neighbors and family friends wanted to hear the story, to understand how the healing had happened, and to celebrate Emma's recovery. But Emma found this attention embarrassing, and sometimes retreated into temporary silence when she felt overwhelmed by people's expectations. Ruby became Emma's advocate in these situations, helping others understand that Emma's healing was ongoing, and that she needed space to continue growing at her own pace. Ruby's protective instincts, honed by years of raising her own children, helped shield Emma from people who were more curious than caring. The most significant change was in Margaret and Emma's relationship. With communication restored, they began to rebuild their bond in ways that acknowledged how much both of them had grown and changed since David's death. Margaret learned to really listen to Emma's thoughts and feelings instead of trying to anticipate or manage them. Emma, in turn, began to understand her mother's own grief and the ways Margaret had been struggling to cope with single parenthood. They established new family traditions that honored both their loss and their healing. Sunday evening piano concerts became a regular event, where Emma would perform her latest compositions for Margaret and Ruby. These weren't formal recitals, but intimate sharing sessions where music served as a bridge between their different ways of processing emotions. Emma also began talking about her father in ways that brought comfort rather than pain. She shared happy memories freely, asked questions about things she had been too young to understand when he was alive, and even created musical tributes to honor his memory. This open discussion of David helped Margaret begin to heal from her own grief, which she had suppressed in order to focus on Emma's needs. Ruby's role in the family evolved from employee to trusted family friend. Margaret had come to rely on Ruby's wisdom and experience, particularly her understanding of how children process trauma and healing. Emma viewed Ruby as a second mother figure, someone who had been present during her most vulnerable period and had never lost faith in her eventual recovery. But Ruby was also aware that her work with the Whitmore family was entering a new phase. Emma no longer needed the intensive support that Ruby had provided during her silent years. The little girl was ready to engage more fully with the outside world, to form new relationships, and to explore opportunities that had been limited by her communication challenges. The question Ruby faced was whether her continued presence might actually hinder Emma's growth. She had seen this pattern before in her work with other families. Sometimes the very people who helped create healing needed to step back to allow that healing to flourish independently. Ruby began to consider whether Emma and Margaret were ready to navigate their new relationship without her constant presence. This question became more pressing as winter turned to spring. Emma's confidence was growing daily, and she was expressing interest in activities that would take her outside the protective bubble of their household. She wanted to join the school choir, participate in a community theater production, and spend time with new friends she was making at school. Ruby realized that the greatest gift she could give Emma might be the confidence to know that her voice would remain strong even without Ruby's daily support. The little girl who had once been too frightened to speak was becoming a confident, articulate young person who was ready to share her gifts with the world. Spring brought new possibilities and difficult decisions to the Whitmore household. Emma had been speaking confidently for 4 months now, and her transformation was remarkable. She had joined the school choir, where her beautiful voice and natural musicality made her a standout performer. She was also participating in a local children's theater group, where her years of careful observation had given her unexpected talents for understanding character and emotion. Ruby watched these developments with pride and growing certainty that her time with the family was reaching a natural conclusion. Emma no longer needed the intensive support and careful protection that Ruby had provided during her healing process. The little girl was ready to spread her wings and engage with the world in ways that had been impossible during her silent years. Margaret had also grown tremendously during this period. She had learned to communicate with Emma in deeper, more meaningful ways and had begun to heal from her own grief about David's death. Mother and daughter had developed a strong, honest relationship built on mutual respect and understanding rather than fear and overprotection. The conversation about Ruby's future with the family began during one of their regular piano sessions. Emma was playing a complex piece she had composed herself, something that told the story of her journey from silence to song. As the music filled the room, Ruby felt a bittersweet recognition that her work here was complete. After Emma finished playing, she turned to Ruby with the kind of direct honesty that had become characteristic of her communication style. She asked Ruby if she was thinking about leaving them, because she had noticed that Ruby seemed different lately, proud but also sad, like someone preparing to say goodbye. Ruby was amazed by Emma's perceptiveness but not entirely surprised. The little girl had always been remarkably observant, and her years of silence had only sharpened her ability to read emotions and unspoken thoughts. Ruby decided to be honest about her feelings, explaining that she was incredibly proud of how strong and confident Emma had become. Margaret joined the conversation, and together the three of them talked openly about what Ruby's departure might mean. It was a difficult discussion, filled with gratitude, love, and the sadness that comes with any meaningful ending. But it was also a celebration of how far they had all come since that first day when Ruby had watched Emma drift through the house like a lost ghost. Emma surprised both adults by being the one to articulate what they were all feeling. She said that Ruby had been like a bridge that helped her cross from the scary, silent place where she had been trapped back to the world of family and friends and music. But now that she was safely across, she didn't need the bridge anymore, though she would never forget how important it had been. The decision was made gradually and with careful planning. Ruby would stay through the end of the school year, helping Emma transition to greater independence while ensuring that the family's new communication patterns remained strong. Then she would move on to a new position, though she would always remain a part of the Whitmore family's extended circle. During her final months with the family, Ruby focused on helping Emma and Margaret strengthen their own relationship. She encouraged them to develop their own traditions and communication rituals that didn't depend on her presence. The Sunday piano concerts evolved into more elaborate family music nights where Margaret's improving piano skills complemented Emma's compositions. Ruby also helped Emma prepare for the social challenges she would face as she became more involved in school and community activities. They practiced conversations about her silent period, helping Emma develop comfortable ways to explain her experience without feeling ashamed or overwhelmed by others' curiosity. Emma's story had become something of a local legend, inspiring other families who were struggling with childhood trauma and communication disorders. Margaret and Ruby were careful to protect Emma's privacy, while also allowing her to help others when she felt comfortable doing so. Emma began visiting other families occasionally, sharing her experience and offering hope to children who were facing similar challenges. The most meaningful development during this transition period was watching Emma become a source of healing for others. She had a natural ability to connect with children who were struggling with their own communication challenges, perhaps because she understood so deeply what it felt like to be trapped inside silence. Ruby's final day with the family was both joyful and heartbreaking. Emma had planned a special concert featuring all the songs that had been important in their relationship, from the first gospel melodies Ruby had hummed in the kitchen to complex compositions Emma had created to express her gratitude and love. Margaret presented Ruby with a beautiful letter of recommendation that praised not only her professional skills but also her extraordinary ability to understand and nurture a traumatized child. More importantly, she offered Ruby a standing invitation to return to their home whenever she wanted, making it clear that Ruby would always be considered family. Emma's gift to Ruby was a handwritten book containing all the drawings and written communications they had shared during her silent period, along with new artwork that showed their friendship and Ruby's role in her healing. The final page contained a simple but profound message. "Thank you for helping me find my voice. I will use it to help others find theirs too." 6 months after Ruby left the Whitmore household, she received a letter from Emma describing her latest adventures. The little girl was thriving in school, had made several close friends, and was performing regularly with both the school choir and the community theater group. She had also started volunteering with a local organization that worked with children who had experienced trauma. Margaret included a note in the same envelope, describing how their family life had continued to flourish. She had started dating again, something that had seemed impossible during Emma's silent years. Emma was excited about the possibility of having a stepfather, showing remarkable resilience and openness to new relationships. Most importantly, Emma's voice had remained strong and confident. She was no longer the silent child who had retreated from the world in self-protection. Instead, she had become an articulate, empathetic young person who used her gifts to bring joy and healing to others. Ruby kept this letter in her purse and read it whenever she needed reminding that love, patience, and understanding could work miracles that no amount of money or professional intervention could achieve. Emma had found her voice not through expensive therapy or medical treatment, but through the simple gift of being seen, accepted, and loved exactly as she was. The story of Emma and Ruby became a testament to the power of human connection across boundaries of race, class, and circumstance. It proved that healing often comes from the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the most profound wisdom comes not from textbooks or degrees, but from the lived experience of people who have faced their own struggles with courage and grace. Years later, when Emma was grown and had children of her own, she would tell them about Ruby, the woman who had helped her remember that her voice was a gift worth sharing with the world. And whenever she encountered a child who had retreated into protective silence, Emma would think of Ruby's patient presence and gentle understanding, passing on the same gifts she had received during her own journey from silence to song,